what do you make of that notion that Andrew touched on there about the prospect of eliminating this thing? Do you think that that's what the authorities, what the policymakers are aiming for?
Well, it's thanks for having me on, Kieran. Well, it's unclear. I mean, we asked that question in the hearing today. What is the government's strategy? Is it suppression, containment, elimination, eradication? And certainly the response from the officials today was that's not clear. The government doesn't have in a sense, a one-word strategy about how they're approaching this virus. But we'll certainly continue to look at that at future hearings of the committee.
When you look at the broader numbers, from what you heard this morning from the Chief Medical Officer, the Secretary of the Health Department, was there anything that concerned you, given, broadly we're in a pretty good place right now in terms of Australia's health numbers?
Yes, that's right, and I think that's a real credit to the Australian people who have adhered and accepted and adopted all of the restrictions that have been imposed on all of us as we go around our day-to-day lives. Look, I think there are issues that we identified in the hearing today. We talked about the app, we talked about the Ruby Princess, we talked about schools, we talked about what exactly is the government's approach to the virus. Is it elimination? Is it suppression? And some of the answers we got will certainly lead to more questions, I think, particularly around concerns around the app. And I think the Ruby Princess certainly is an unfolding story that's got a lot more to go in it.
Yeah, there is a Ruby Princess developing story on that, of course, a long way to go with the inquiry and so on. But on the app, let me ask you, will you sign up for that?
Look, I mean, my inclination is to, because I'm a community member that wants to help other community members, and if I had the virus and it turned out that I could help others, to be identified through that, then that's the way I would lean towards. But I have to say that some of the messaging about how the app is being put together, how the information will be contained, some of the privacy restrictions, the interaction between the data ownership and how it's used by state and territory authorities, and some of the information handling to the public around the app, I think hasn't always given you a real sense of security and safety around this app. I think officials are trying to deal with that, but even today we had advice that legislation might not be needed for the app when we've had government ministers saying legislation would be needed for the app. So we accept this work is unfolding, but I think when we are talking about use of technology for this purpose, it almost runs alongside the fact that you've got to have some pretty clear guidelines and principles in place at the earliest to get to the community buy-in, because without the community buy-in, the app's no good to anybody.
The Prime Minister was adamant, though, today, Senator, that once it's used by the health officials, that's it, it's gone. It won't be shared with any other agency. It was a pretty emphatic guarantee there from the PM.
Look, yes, and we've had comments from him, we've had comments from other ministers that aren't as clear. We've had evidence to the committee today about whether or not there will be legislation required or not. That's still in development. So I think, it's fair to say at the moment we're being asked to consider signing up without all the information before us. And I think the important thing is that we need all the information so that people can make the decision about whether or not they're prepared to go with it, so that it actually can serve the purpose that those public health officials want. And I think that's the missing link at the moment. We actually need all of the information, and that information isn't there because the app's not ready, and it's still being developed.
One of the things that was new today, I guess, was the revelation from the Chief Medical Officer that Northwest Tasmania, that outbreak was from one passenger off the Ruby Princess. I hadn't heard that prior to today's hearing. Was that a surprise to you?
Yes, I think there'd been speculation around the Northwest cluster in Tasmania and how that actually occurred, where it started. And I'd heard speculation, but that was the first time I've heard confirmation that that is what the Chief Medical Officer believes it to be. And again, it goes back to, I think, questions around the handling of the Ruby Princess, the fact that Prime Minister gave a promise that cruise ships would be banned from coming into port. A few days later, the Ruby Princess arrives, and then there's this disembarkation of passengers in a clearly unsafe way that has ended up being the biggest single source of infection in the country. So I think, you know, the Chief Medical Officer also accepted today that mistakes were made in relation to the disembarkation of that ship. Who's at fault in that regard, and how will these issues be dealt with and prevented from happening in the past remains to be seen, and is subject to that commission of inquiry, but will certainly be subject to further inquiry by this committee, particularly the role of Border Force and the Department of Agriculture in terms of the responsibilities they had.
And Senator, are you also looking at the timeline here? Who knew what at what point in terms of not just Brendan Murphy and his officials, but what he then reported to the senior figures in the government? And I guess within that, how much China had withheld information in a couple of those crucial days?
Yes, so we started that discussion today and found out that whilst the Australian government through the Chief Medical Officer was given information from the World Health Organisation, I think on the 1st of January this year, it wasn't really until the 19th or 20th of January that the Australian response really escalated and got into gear. So I think there are still some questions about what happened between the 1st of January and the 19th and 20th of January, and then going forward, what steps were taken, who was informed, how were they informed, what was being discussed. All of those questions need to be forensically examined, I think, and we'll do that at future hearings. We are hoping to meet twice a week in non-sitting weeks for public hearings, so there's plenty of opportunity to pursue those matters more closely.
We'll stay in touch then. Thank you, Senator Katy Gallagher, Chair of the Select Committee on the COVID-19 outbreak.